أهلا بكل الذين ينضموا للاستماع إلى راديو بلدي أول راديو عربي أمريكي ويعنى بقضايا العرب في المهجر. برامجنا في راديو بلدي كل يوم جمعة من 8 وحتى 9 صباحا مع ليلى الحسيني في بث حي ومباشر عبر WNZK راديو 690 AM. صباح الخير بلدي، صباح الخير لكل مستمعينا.
Welcome to Radio Baladi, the first Arab, Middle Eastern and American simulcast radio show. Radio Baladi is broadcast every Friday morning on WNZK 690 AM from 8 until 9 Eastern Time on Good Morning Michigan with Layla Al-Husseini. Our call-in number 248-557-3300. And now, stay tuned for the best radio talk show on Arab and American issues with your host, Layla Al-Husseini.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNZK 690 AM and WZNZ 700 AM. Good morning, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park, and an expert on Arab and Muslim media. Today, we are having part 2 of our interview with veteran journalist and Al Jazeera Bureau Chief, Dr. Abdulrahim Fukara. Dr. Fukara is the U.S. Bureau Chief for Al Jazeera Arabic and host of its flagship weekly show, Min Washington, or From Washington, which is a program dealing with U.S. affairs and how they affect the rest of the world, and in particular, the Middle East and North Africa region. He is also a member and secretary of Al Jazeera America's Board of Directors. Prior to joining Al Jazeera in 2002, Dr. Fukara was senior editor of alafrica.com, one of the world's largest providers of African news and analysis, which he had come to from The World, a Boston-based co-production of the BBC World Service, PRI, and WGBH Boston. Dr. Fukara moved to the U.S. in 1999 from London, where he had worked in various capacities at the BBC for 9 years. He holds a PhD in apartheid studies and is a frequent guest on NPR, MSNBC, and various other U.S. outlets. He was born in Morocco. Welcome again to the show, Dr. Abdulrahim Fukara.
Thank you, Sahar. Good to be with you again on the bridge.
Thank you very much again for giving us some of your precious time and sharing with us your insights on a very important topic. In this part 2 of the interview, we would like to focus more on some of the paradoxes and controversies or controversial issues that are oftentimes raised around Al Jazeera that we did not have a chance to tap into or touch upon in the first part of this interview. And I would like to start by stating the notion that it is no secret that when Al Jazeera was first introduced to the Arab media landscape, it was hailed by many as a supporter of democracy and freedom and breaking many of the social and political taboos in the region. But it's also no secret that one of the main criticisms that get oftentimes voiced against Al Jazeera is the fact that it does not criticize by any means the Qatari royal family or the state of Qatar, which happens to be its main sponsor or supporter. So I don't know if you want to actually explain to us or try to discuss this very particular point.
Well, let me first of all state the general principle, which is that Al Jazeera is an imperfect medium in an imperfect world. Mm-hmm. As you said in your introduction, when it came into being at its inception in the middle of the 1990s, the media scene in the Arab region was almost fundamentally different from what it is today. At that time, it was dominated by stations and outlets owned by governments in each Arab country, and the coverage, most of it at that time on those outlets, focused on what the head of state of that particular country that we could be talking about did on a given day. When Al Jazeera came into being, it basically, excuse the word, it trashed that. All that went into the editorial garbage can. And what became the focus was suddenly seen through a very wide prism. The situation of Arabs, whether as countries or as individuals, the place in the world where they lived, the intersection of what happens in the region and what happens outside the region. And this particular criticism that you are talking about now, it's been made consistently since the inception of Al Jazeera. A lot of people would say, yes, it's great, it's fantastic that Al Jazeera, does all this groundbreaking stuff, but at the end of the day, it hardly ever focuses on Qatar, the country that actually funds Al Jazeera. And the question, the answer to that that I would put forth, again, if you'll allow me, is basically twofold. One is that, look, in general, governments, whether they are in a democratic country, semi-democratic country, or dictatorship, governments generally, they don't like to be in the limelight, except when they want to be. Meaning what? Meaning that if, for example, you're talking about Tony Blair in 2003, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, he was the prime minister of a country which is considered to be the cradle of parliamentary democracy, the United Kingdom. And yet, what he did with the BBC, for example, when the BBC claimed that he had sexed up, to use the exact words, intelligence to basically make it look like Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, Tony Blair and Tony Blair's government didn't like that light being shed on it. It took the BBC to court. So governments in general, they don't like to be in the limelight. I was having a conversation with Bob Woodward a while back, and he said that he had a conversation with the Bill Clinton's vice president at that time. And the vice president's claim was that we know only 1% of what the U.S. administration did at that time. But Woodward doesn't agree. He thinks that we know 70%. Bottom line is, governments do not like to be in the limelight. Now, for the Qatari government, this criticism has been made consistently. But the response that has also been consistently made is that what happens in Qatar that would actually warrant the kind of coverage that Al Jazeera would give to Egypt or to Libya or to other parts of the world. The argument is that nothing much happens in Qatar. Yes, there is stuff that sometimes happens, and, that it could be covered, but the consistency of events, important events that affect the realities and the history of the Middle East that we see, for example, in a country like, let's say, Egypt, that doesn't happen in Qatar. And we could argue about, yes, even if there's a tiny thing that happens in Qatar, why Al Jazeera covers it or doesn't cover it. The fact remains that the Qataris, and I don't work for the Qataris, I work for Al Jazeera, but I'm trying to elucidate a point here. The Qataris have created an outlet that has given them power and prestige. It has given the Arabs in general a position or the tool to put themselves in a better position as far as the rest of the world knowing their concerns. It has given the Americans, for example, a platform from which they can address Arab audiences, given the extent of U.S. national interest in that part of the world. So, okay, for the people who want to say Jazeera doesn't deal with Qatar much because Qatar funds it, fine. If they want to say that, they can say it. It's probably a legitimate point. The fact is that this network, ever since its inception, has changed not just the media scene. It has changed the media scene, and it has contributed to fundamentally transforming the political scene in the region. And sometimes if you have a small price to pay, you have a small price to pay. There is no independent, 100% independent media in the world, whether you're in a democracy, semi-democracy, or dictatorship.
Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with you on the part that there is no 100% democracy. There is also no 100% complete objectivity either, as much as we would like to believe that as media people, we're objective. There is always a margin of subjectivity in every media platform and outlet. But let me tell you, as a communication scholar myself, that people see this in the light of a principle commonly known as, quote-unquote, democracy everywhere but here. In other words, that countries or nations or states are willing, especially in this, in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, or the Arab region, to promote democracy in other nations, in other states, neighboring countries, but not necessarily at home. In the few remaining points before our commercial break, would you like to comment on this particular principle and whether you see it as accurate or not?
Well, look, I mean, I'll let the Qataris speak for their own politics and policies. I'm neither Qatari nor do I work for the Qatari government. I work for Al Jazeera, and there's a lot of debate about this point that you have just raised. To what extent are the Qataris doing what many other people in the Arab world are now talking about, which is the democratization of their own country? You could argue until you're blue in the face about this, because for everyone who says that Qatar does not do what it preaches, and I don't know what Qatar preaches, by the way, but for everyone who says that, you'll get a Qatari who will say, look, this is the situation we have back in Qatar. This is a stable country. This is a country that has made giant strides in terms of positioning itself regionally, in terms of developing itself. You could never end that argument. But the bottom line for me, since we're talking about Al Jazeera here, is that this is a channel that is certainly imperfect in many, many, many ways, and you could find fault with its coverage, at so many different points in history. But the fact remains that this channel has transformed the media scene and the politics of an entire region, things that, as you said in your introduction, that would have been virtually impossible to talk about in the Arab world. Taboos, position of women, the role of religion, and the list goes on, suddenly started being talked about and debated in depth in the Arab region, thanks in no small measure to Al Jazeera.
Absolutely, and that's why it was hailed by many as a new form of media that was not really witnessed before 1996, when Al Jazeera Arabic was founded for the first time, and was hailed by some media scholars as, quote-unquote, the Democratic Republic of Al Jazeera. In other words, they saw it as a new spotlight for a new form of democratic outlet, or let's say a platform where alternative voices could be heard in a fashion that was never witnessed before. We will come back again to this important topic right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
It's never too early to get your child on the right track. From their first words to first grade, Dreamy Children's Center in Troy works closely with parents to provide an experience that goes beyond early education. The highly qualified and experienced staff use a variety of programs that can help nurture important personality traits like responsibility, independence, problem solving, motivation, and respect. They also have educational programs ranging from preschooling for infants, toddlers, transitional toddlers, and pre-K to Montessori-approved programs and bilingual curriculums for young children. They're open from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., can provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner with snacks in between, and can also arrange for after-school pickup. Dreamy Children's Center in Troy is located at 37373 DeQuinder, just above 16 Mile Road, and can be found on Facebook at Dreamy Children's Center. Ask about the free preschool program. Call today, 248-680-9170, 248-680-9170. Dr. Opada Al-Zuhaili is a diabetes and endocrinology specialist with over 12 years of experience in medical research dealing with diabetes patients. Dr. Zuhaili lectures in many American and Arab universities about the latest research and studies related to diabetes. Al-Zuhaili Medical Centers are fully equipped to provide you with the best in medical treatment. Whether Arabic or English, our staff of medical professionals speak your language and can provide for your comfort and care. You're always welcome at Al-Zuhaili Medical Centers. Please visit our Southfield location at 27207 Losser Road, and for appointments call 248-809-5988. That's 248-809-5988.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arabs, WNZK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland. And with me this morning is a distinguished guest, Dr. Abdulrahim Fukara, the U.S. Bureau Chief for Al Jazeera Arabic and the host of its flagship weekly program, Min Washington. We were talking before the commercial break about some of the paradoxes and challenges and controversies around Al Jazeera, and we talked about its relationship to the Qatari government and how much of editorial freedom does it have in criticizing the Qatari government, if at all. Another point that surfaced recently with the coverage of the Arab Spring upheavals or uprisings in the region has been the discrepancy in the way Al Jazeera covers some of these uprisings. For example, it devoted like almost 24/7 coverage minute by minute to what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Libya, what happened in Egypt, of course, most prominently. But we did not see much coverage, for example, of Bahrain. In fact, 6 Al Jazeera journalists or correspondents have submitted resignations in objection to the what they saw as the unfair or unbalanced coverage when it came to the upheaval or the uprising in Bahrain in particular. Can you please comment on this particular point?
Well, I mean, let's start let's start with the obvious, and the obvious is the case of Egypt. It goes without saying that no matter how much coverage you devote to a country like Egypt, it's probably not going to be enough, even in normal times. This is a country which is really at the heart of everything in the region, and not just geographically. It's at the heart of Arab history and Arab politics, and therefore everything that happens there is bound to resonate and have implications elsewhere in the region, hence the extent of the coverage. You know, with Tunisia, one difference between Egypt and Tunisia in terms of what Al Jazeera did or did not do 4 years ago, Al Jazeera had invested in the infrastructure, in its infrastructure, Al Jazeera's infrastructure in Egypt, for heavily for more than a decade for the reasons that I've just explained. It had developed a network of correspondence. It had, developed a network of guests, and so on. It was a very substantial, financially, it was a very substantial investment. That had not happened in Tunisia. Tunisia, the conventional wisdom was that this is a small country, not as central to Arab history and politics as a country like Egypt is, and therefore the Jazeera had not invested in the same way in Tunisia that it had invested in Egypt. But it's also because Ben Ali at that time made it very difficult for Al Jazeera to invest in its infrastructure in Tunisia or to do anything in Tunisia. So 3 days after the outbreak of the protests, Al Jazeera was still struggling to come to terms with what does this mean actually. And it wasn't until later on that, Al Jazeera began to sort of read the writing on the wall for the Ben Ali regime and assess properly the direction things were going in Tunisia. Then the coverage started to be where it ended up being. Now, you mentioned Bahrain.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's going to be very difficult for me to go back and assess the details of the coverage or lack thereof in Bahrain 4 years after the fact. But I do remember that there was a degree of coverage of the protests in Bahrain when they first started around the Lu'lu'a square in Manama.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, a lot of people are unhappy with Al Jazeera's coverage. They say it's not, it wasn't adequate, it wasn't enough, especially compared with the blanket coverage of a country like Egypt. But then again, in Bahrain, you have to remember that the Bahraini government made it very difficult for Al Jazeera to cover the protests in Bahrain. There was the beginnings of a movement, of a protest. Al Jazeera got in, started to cover it. Things started to go down, to go quiet for a little while, but they blew up elsewhere in the region. So Al Jazeera got its crew out of Bahrain to send them, I believe, to Libya, if my memory serves me right. But when things started to blow up again in Bahrain and Al Jazeera tried to get in, the Bahraini government said, no way. Now, here's where I think the problem that you are trying to elucidate is, because Bahrain is so close to Qatar geographically, it's in the Gulf. I heard this criticism a lot back at that time on the blogosphere, that the Qataris were not willing to let Al Jazeera cover Bahrain the same way that it had covered Egypt and so on, because this was too close to home, so to speak. These are criticisms that I hear, and if people want to make that conclusion, they're entitled to it. I do not have any facts, hard facts, that tell me that Al Jazeera received directions or orders from the Qatari government to do this or to do that in Bahrain or elsewhere in the region. I simply cannot, as a member of Al Jazeera, I cannot make that leap of faith that because Qatar funds Al Jazeera, Qatar told Al Jazeera don't cover Bahrain. But if people want to jump to that conclusion, you cannot stop people jumping to that conclusion. In terms of analysis, it probably makes sense if you're analyzing the situation from a distance. But in the reality of things, I do not have any evidence that the Qatari government said to Al Jazeera, okay, I give you the money, so you must do what I tell you to do in terms of covering or not covering Bahrain. But Al Jazeera, because of these issues, has found itself in new territory in the region. You know, for Al Jazeera went from 1996 to 2001 being extremely highly credible in the eyes of the peoples of the region. Governments hated Al Jazeera. Many governments in the region hated Al Jazeera. To a situation where the political and the media ground had shifted, beginning with 2011. So Al Jazeera found itself in this new situation where many people, not just governments, many people started to scratch their heads and say, "Was I right to support this channel?" And you know, the bottom line is this: the so-called Arab Spring was not just about regimes. The so-called Arab Spring was also and particularly about the media in the region. The media scene has changed. I wouldn't say fundamentally, but it has changed in ways that have put Al Jazeera and many other networks in the face of unprecedented challenges. I mean, we have. Look, I went to Canada about a year ago to see if we could, if the Canadians would allow Al Jazeera to start broadcasting into Canada without any conditions. This is after 2011. It has to be reminded. In the old days before 2011, most of the people who opposed Al Jazeera's presence in Canada were some members of the Jewish community who had accused Al Jazeera of anti-Semitism. Well, not now. The topsy-turviness has been so astounding that now you get many members of the Egyptian community in Canada and many members of the Syrian community in Canada who are absolutely, totally, adamantly opposed to Al Jazeera being able to have a presence or to broadcast into Canada. So, you know, you could start with Bahrain and go in so many different directions, and at the end of the day, the lesson that I draw from all of this is that the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, has changed the media scene, has made the ground very difficult, even for a channel like Al Jazeera. But look, just to conclude, at the end of the day, what happened in Egypt, for example, with the coup, I sometimes feel that without Al Jazeera's coverage of the protests that ensued after the coup, probably the world would not have known much about those protests, because when the current president, Abdel Fattah Sisi, when he took over, it basically any voices of dissent in the media were shut down. Al Jazeera was the only one that continued to focus on that situation, to show the world that there were protests. And because of that, at the end of the day, you're going to have to do what you think is right, whether people like it or they don't like it. And I'm not just talking about Egypt. I'm just talking about Bahrain or anywhere else in the region.
Right. In just a couple of minutes before we go to the commercial break, do you have any explanation for why the documentary Shouting in the Dark, which I think was an excellent documentary about the uprising in Bahrain that I actually showed to my students in my Arab media course at University of Maryland, because it was so, stunning. It has been shown on Al Jazeera English only once, and then it was never allowed to air again. Do you have any, explanation or information on this?
Sahar, I do not. I know that, again, there are a lot of people saying because it upset the Bahraini government, and the other governments in the region put pressure on the Qataris, and the Qataris put pressure on Al Jazeera to cancel it. I read this criticism, and I've read it. It has been out there consistently. Again, I do not have any evidence that, in terms of policy, that's actually what happened. I know that the Bahrainis have always been paying much more careful attention to Al Jazeera Arabic than to Al Jazeera English. They did allow Al Jazeera English, after all, to go in and make that film and talk to people in Bahrain. And again, the same way that people would analyze, like I've just said now, the relationship between the Bahrainis, the Qataris, and Al Jazeera, I could also surmise and say that to them, Al Jazeera Arabic is the channel that they were worried about, and not Al Jazeera English. But later on, they found out that they made a mistake by even allowing Al Jazeera English to go in and film and make that film, given the attention, international attention from outside the region that it drew to Bahrain. Look, these are, as we say in Arabic, this is ijtihad. I mean, these are things that we try to explain, but do we have any evidence to support any of this? I personally do not have any evidence to support all.
Okay, so we're going to revisit again the topic of Al Jazeera, paradoxes, and controversies right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Jumana Kayruz. You've seen her images on giant billboards across the metro. Jumana Kayruz. You've seen her images on buses across the city. Now get to know Jumana Kayruz.
Most people who sit in my office across from my desk are hurting on so many levels. One thing people do not know about medical malpractice is that the statute of limitation, meaning the time that you have to bring suit against a doctor, a hospital, is 2 years. In medical malpractice, that's a very, very short period of time. Not every lawyer is an advocate, but every lawyer should be an advocate.
Let Jumana Kayruz protect your rights. Call the law offices of Jumana Kayruz at 1-866-YOUR-RIGHTS, extension 100, or visit yourrights.com.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Donna, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNDK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and with me this morning is a distinguished guest, Dr. Abdurrahim Fukara, U.S. Bureau Chief of Al Jazeera Arabic and host of its flagship weekly program, Min Washington. We are talking today about some of the paradoxes and controversies in this part 2 of the interview on Al Jazeera. Abdurrahim, I'd like to also ask you about a very important point that has surfaced about Al Jazeera recently in the minds of some people, which is the claim that Al Jazeera is trying to promote, quote-unquote, the Islamization of the region. I see this particular criticism as coming in the context of the deep division and polarization, which has been really surfacing with the Arab Spring movement and what has been going on in some countries, especially in Egypt and also in Syria and other parts of the Arab world. Would you like to comment on this particular point, please?
Well, you know, this issue has always been discussed in the context of conversations about Al Jazeera. Right from the beginning, as I'm sure you're aware, there has always been this notion that many people entertained that Al Jazeera was dominated by the Ikhwan Muslimin, by the Muslim Brotherhood.
The Muslim Brotherhood, yeah.
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood. To what extent it is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, to what extent it caters to the sensibility of Islamists throughout the Middle East and North Africa region. And it continues now. In fact, it's now much more pronounced, obviously, given what's happened in the region over the last 4 years, beginning with the toppling of Mubarak in Egypt until this particular moment when the Muslim Brotherhood continues to be banned and considered as a terrorist organization by the Egyptian government. And the reality is that for the last 20 or 30 years in the Arab region, as you know, Sahar, the Islamist voice has been a very strong voice. Whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, large numbers of Arabs in North Africa and the Middle East have turned to Islamists as a form of opposition, as a form of protest against their conditions, political conditions, economic conditions, social conditions, and so on. You know, again, whether you agree with the Islamists or you disagree with them, they are there. They are not just a political force. They are a social force. They are an economic force. They are a narrative force present in the region. And therefore, if you are a news outlet and you try to ignore that, well, you basically ignoring that at your own risk. But let me say two things. One is the Qatari government supporting the Islamists? Again, I'm not Qatari. I'm not a member of the Qatari government. I let the Qataris speak for that. I have heard them say, though, that they do not support the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example. They say we support the choice of the Egyptian people. So no matter what, I'm not a member of the Qatari government. I'll let the Qatari government speak for itself. But if you watch the coverage of Al Jazeera, and I'm talking about Al Jazeera Arabic, obviously, if you watch on any sustainable time frame, let's say over 24 hours, I would be hard-pressed to be convinced by anyone that all you're going to see, all the programming you're going to see on Al Jazeera caters to the sensibility of Islamists or to the sensibility of the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, the range and diversity of programming, and more importantly, the range and diversity of sensibilities that Al Jazeera caters to is actually quite interesting. Al Jazeera, they'll spend, for example, 3 or 4 hours, let's say, covering protests in Egypt against Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, let's say, when the coup happened, actually even longer than 4 hours a day. But that was a monumental event in the region, and the Muslim Brotherhood was right in the heart of it. It's really hard not to cover it. But outside that programming frame, if you look at the programs on any other day, you'll see documentaries, you'll see programs that target the youth, you'll see programs that target women, you'll see stuff about politics, you'll see stuff about history, you'll see a wide range of programming that tries to basically build a comprehensive picture of what the situation is like in North Africa and the Middle East. And on that ground, I find it really difficult to grapple with this criticism that Al Jazeera caters to Islamists in its programming. I think the facts and the figures of viewership, put that to the test in a really serious way. editorially is, or politically, is Al Jazeera under the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood? I think a lot of people working at Al Jazeera would be absolutely outraged by a statement made by like that, because many people who work for Al Jazeera are not even Muslim. They are from other faiths. So I think we have to be a little careful when we talk about these things. Saying that it caters to an Islamist sensibility is one thing. Saying that it's controlled by Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood is a different thing. The people eventually, they will have to sit down and watch scientifically the programming and judge what percentage of the programming caters to this or that sensibility. But the rest is many of these things tend to be conjecture. There is no denying that Al Jazeera does pay careful attention to Islamist sensibility in the region. But that Islamist sensibility doesn't exist just on Al Jazeera's screen. It does exist in Muslim societies, in Arab societies.
That's a very important point. Thank you for clarifying this, because when I hear such claims as, quote-unquote, Al Jazeera is promoting or supporting the Islamization of the region, I say to myself, wait a minute, what does that exactly mean? We have to put things in context. But I don't know if you will agree with me on that. I think that such types of criticisms are very much a byproduct or a reflection of the deep polarization that we are now seeing and witnessing at this particular stage. Would you agree with me that this is directly related to the polarization in the political atmosphere in the region right now?
Sahar, the polarization also reflects and imposes itself on Al Jazeera's coverage. I mean, if you watch any of the shows, and I keep going back to Egypt because that's really the country that matters more than any other country in both the good and the bad that's happened over the last 4 years. That always happen in the region at large. But if you look at the polarization that's happening within Egyptian society, for example, first of all, I do not have any figures that describe that polarization in Egyptian society. I do not have any exact figures how many people are in support of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups, movements in Egypt. I do not have figures to tell me exactly how many secular people exist in Egypt, how many people support Sisi, how many people are exact Sisi. We tend to have this conversation not based on facts and figures. We tend to have this conversation, based on hunches and based on what others tell us and what we see on television. But if you watch any program on Egypt, on Al Jazeera, let's say Hadith al-Thawra, for example, right from day one, you always had one guest representing, the sensibility of the opposition in Egypt, one guest representing the sensibility of, the people who are in the camp of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and who are against the Muslim Brotherhood. That has been consistent. And, I'm not saying that this to say, look, Al Jazeera is balanced, or I'm saying this to say that polarization, when it happens in reality, on the ground, it affects people. It ultimately will affect a news network that's trying to cover that scene, and that's having a really hard time trying to cover it, because the fact it doesn't have much presence on the ground. Al Jazeera hasn't had much presence on the ground for reasons that we know over the last year or so. So if you want somebody to cover a story well, you allow them to operate freely in that particular country, and then you'll come and say, okay, I'm going to judge you. You did this well, you did that badly. But if you say, no, I'm not going to allow you to do this, I'm going to throw your people in jail, and then you'll come and complain that the coverage is not fair or not balanced, you you've taken the conversation in a different direction. But polarization does exist in Egypt. It does exist in Tunisia. It does exist now in many other Arab countries. And if you watch Al Jazeera's coverage of that, you will see that polarization is, I would even say, unfortunately reflected in the coverage. But reality, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. I think you raised two very important points. The point about access and allowing people to cover the events and the news on the ground, and also the point about editorial balance and trying to present or represent a different perspective and voices. And I bear witness to the fact that when I was interviewed on Al Jazeera, on any occasion, there was always multiplicity of different voices and different views being shared and presented from different parties on the program I was invited to participate in. We will revisit this topic again right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Life for Relief and Development is a nonprofit charity that has been providing humanitarian aid and development to people and communities regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background for over 22 years. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life rushes to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Life also has development projects that provide medical relief, water purification, educational programs, relief for orphans, and much more. Your help and support can greatly improve these efforts. All donations are tax deductible. For more information, please visit our website at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493. That's lifeusa.org, 248-424-7493. It's never too early to get your child on the right track. From their first words to first grade, Dreamy Children's Center in Troy works closely with parents to provide an experience that goes beyond early education. The highly qualified and experienced staff use a variety of programs that can help nurture important personality traits like responsibility, independence, problem solving, motivation, and respect. They also have educational programs ranging from preschooling for infants, toddlers, transitional toddlers, and pre-K to Montessori-approved programs and bilingual curriculums for young children. They're open from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., can provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner with snacks in between, and can also arrange for after-school pickup. Dreamy Children's Center in Troy is located at 37373 DeQuinder, just above 16 Mile Road, and can be found on Facebook at Dreamy Children's Center. Ask about the free preschool program. Call today, 248-680-9170, 248-680-9170.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNDK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and with me this morning is a distinguished guest, Dr. Abdurrahim Fukara, U.S. Bureau Chief of Al Jazeera Arabic and host of its flagship weekly program, Min Washington. And we are talking today about some of the controversial and paradoxical issues around Al Jazeera in this second part of the interview. In this last part of the interview today, I would like to also raise another issue that oftentimes surfaces about Al Jazeera, which is the paradoxical love-hate relationship between Al Jazeera and the West in general and the U.S. in particular. It is no secret that to some degree there is, some kind of adoring of Al Jazeera in the West because it opened a platform of free expression that was unprecedented in the past. However, there is also no secret that there is a lot of criticism voiced at Al Jazeera sometimes for what is called, quote-unquote, anti-Western sentiments or being anti-American and, showing sometimes the ugly face of war and conflict in the region in an unprecedented manner. Would you please like to comment on this a little bit?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always go back to my basic premise, which is that no medium is a perfect medium because we all live in an imperfect world. And as you rightly pointed out, Al Jazeera's relationship with the West in general, but with the United States in particular, it has gone through ups and downs, and probably will go through ups and downs in the future. I think both the Americans and Al Jazeera accept the fact that they cannot always agree and say things are hunky-dory between us. When Bill Clinton was in power, he referred to Al Jazeera as a beacon of democracy. Then 9/11 happened, and the invasion of Afghanistan after that. And Al Jazeera, in terms of the war in Afghanistan, it took an editorial and philosophical line that was different from what the Bush administration had in mind. Al Jazeera's position with that war and with many other wars, and people will agree or disagree on this, but I'm just stating what I believe is a fact. Al Jazeera's position on covering war has always been that civilians basically are what it's all about, because they end up paying or bearing the brunt of the violence, whether it's coming from, in the case of Afghanistan, whether it was coming from the U.S. forces or from other forces in Afghanistan, such as the Taliban. So for the Bush administration to start seeing pictures of civilian casualties in Afghanistan on Al Jazeera, that ran counter to the plan for the Bush administration, because Americans care a lot about this issue, and American public opinion, as we saw, for example, in Vietnam and many other wars, when Americans start seeing the real face of war, whether in terms of civilian casualties on the other side or of U.S. Forces who have fallen on the battlefield, that changes the domestic dynamics here in the United States, and therefore it forces the government prosecuting that war into a difficult corner. So the Bush administration didn't like that. We went through ups and downs between Al Jazeera and the Bush administration until basically the advent of the Obama administration. With the advent of the Obama administration, Obama went to Cairo, made his famous speech, and the gist of that speech is that, hey, look, I want to start a new page in relations between the United States and the Muslim world. He saw Al Jazeera as having a very important role to play in terms of providing the platform for America and Americans to address their concerns and interests to that part of the world, the Muslim world. And then we had events in 2011. The narrative in the early stages of those so-called Arab Spring revolutions, the narrative was freedom and justice. That's what the protesters were basically all about in those early stages. That's something that many Americans could identify with. Al Jazeera was able to relay the flavor of what was actually happening inside Arab minds during those early stages to the rest of the world, to the United States. Al Jazeera in Egypt, for example, it was able not just to relay the flavor of the event, it was able to actually delve deep into possibly the causes of why people were doing what they were doing in Tahrir Square. And in Zahar, as we all know, here in the United States, we had the United States government scratching its head, trying to work out what's going on, what's happening, where is this leading to. And the focus was on Al Jazeera constantly. I on at least one occasion, I went to the White House to talk to President Obama's press secretary at that time. And that's what they were watching. They were watching Jazeera trying to make sense of what was happening in the region. So that was another stage. My sense is that both people in the Arab world and in the United States accept that Al Jazeera is an imperfect. The coverage of Al Jazeera will always have problems, and it will always have controversies, and it will always, some people will like it. It will make always other people very unhappy. But that's the reality is that the realities of the Arab world are very controversial. And the region is riddled with dilemma. And if you are a news outlet that genuinely tries to be a reflection of what happens in the region, you will also, as a news network, be riddled with dilemma. That's part of the deal. But the channel has definitely made waves. It's covered a lot of ground since its inception. It's made a lot of friends. It's made a lot of enemies. That's part of the deal.
And maybe a good representative of this point you're making is that it was hailed by Hillary Clinton, as representing an excellent form of coverage of the Arab Spring that she wanted other media to actually mimic or imitate. But at the same time, it was also described by some American politicians, like Rumsfeld, for example, as, the terror TV or being anti-American. And I think this is mainly in the context of showing some graphic images of war and people being injured and so on, that some Western critics found to be too graphic and sometimes too emotional. In just 1 minute, if you please, because we're running out of time, unfortunately, if you can just comment on this particular criticism of Al Jazeera being too graphic or too emotional. What is your take on this, especially Al Jazeera Arabic?
Well, look, I mean, for Sahar, for us Arabs, I mean, the situation over the last 60 years has been a really difficult situation in the Middle East. War after war and conflict after conflict. And therefore the tolerance threshold that people in the region have developed is much, much higher. The threshold tolerance for blood and gore is much higher than what it is here in the United States. But that's only part of it. The other part of it is that if you want to cover with credibility what happens anywhere, I think you're going to have to make a decision how much of that blood and gore you will be prepared to show. There are limits. There are always limits. But this is the main difference between Al Jazeera and many of the American networks. Many of the American networks start with the assumption that Americans don't want to see it. But we, even here in the U.S., we hear voices saying no. If the government of the United States takes the country to war, then the public has the right to see the real face of that war. The degree of showing the real face of war is the controversial part here. And Al Jazeera also, in many instances, shied away from showing the full extent of the face of war. But Americans here at home, and good for them, they for the last 60 years, they haven't had the kind of, continuous political turbulence that produces blood and gore.
Well, at the end of this very informative and very enlightening interview, I would like very much to thank our distinguished guest this morning, Dr. Abdurrahim Fukara, U.S. Bureau Chief of Al Jazeera Arabic and host of its flagship weekly program, Min Washington. Thank you so much, Abdurrahim, for sharing your time and your insight with us again.
It's great to be with you, Sahar, always. It's a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation with you and with your listeners. Thanks very much for having me on the bridge.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all our listeners who joined us today. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. Thank you very much and goodbye.